So let's begin. Um, Hello, everybody, and welcome to this discussion of this book, Hindu Astrology by Dr. A.P. Stone. Now, Dr. Stone was a very interesting man. He studied for his first degree in mathematics at Oxford, and then his PhD in theoretical physics, also at Oxford University, and then came to India, where he taught mathematics for decades, for I think 3 decades. First in near Calcutta, then in Kerala, and then in Madras, if I remember correctly, and eventually in Delhi, which is where I met him, and which is where I also met LT. So, briefly, to do introductions of our two panelists, Garima, of course, is very well known as the author of the book Heavens and Earth, which is a history, a fascinating and absolutely authoritative history of astrology from ancient times to the present and around the world. It couldn't be better, couldn't be greater in scope. So that's Garima. And then LT and I, as I mentioned, met each other in Delhi, where we also met Dr. Stone. So Dr. Stone, LT, and I knew each other in Delhi from the 70s onwards. Then, of course, when I left Delhi in 1973 to go to the eastern part of India, LT and I lost touch. I lost touch also with Dr. Stone. But Dr. Stone I met later on, many years later on, which I'll come to in our discussions. But first, Garima, if I may start with you, our discussion. In this book, what kind of impression do you get of Dr. Stone as a human being?
Right. So thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for the generous introduction. When you asked me to write about Hindu astrology, like a forward for Hindu astrology, so I was really curious to read, what Dr. Stone had written. But I think what fascinated me the most, right at the start, was, here's a person who is not an Indian, who, did his studies in Oxford, as you mentioned, in mathematics and experimental physics, and he spent a lot of time in India. So usually, when you have academics or journalists or thinkers like that, who are coming in from outside and spending time in India, they're not really all that interested in their surroundings. They, kind of live in their own bubble, in their own atmosphere. But I thought it was really interesting that he was not only interested in the surroundings, but he actually, he even went ahead to study a bit of Sanskrit so that he could research astrology, Jyotish, in a more, original way, and then write about it. So first of that seemed very interesting to me, that someone who's a complete outsider would get into an atmosphere and then, try to understand it, explore it with such sincerity and such depth. The other thing that really fascinated me was how balanced his take on astrology was. At the end of the book, Mr. Stone writes that if you are a person of faith, if you have any kind of belief, that's enough. Like, you don't need to believe in anything else to navigate the uncertainties of life and everything else. So, but I think that could have gone either way. When people are unfamiliar to a particular belief system, they can have a tendency to either validate it or invalidate it. Or, someone who was coming from such a technical background, mathematics and physics, he could have looked at astrology with a very, jaundiced or a negative perspective. But neither of those things, come out in the book. And I was really fascinated by how balanced and how sober his exploration of astrology is. So I think that tells me a lot about, who he was as a person.
Thank you. That's very helpful and very interesting that you saw him that way. Of course, you never met him. At LT, you did meet him, you knew him. What was your impression of him as a human being? Or maybe we can please start, if you don't mind, even with a different question. When was the first time you met him? And what was your first impression of him, if you don't mind?
I don't think she has met him, Prabhu, has she?
No,
Met him
Garima never
in
met
the
LT.
book, you mean?
Garima never met Dr. Stone. No.
Okay.
But you met him, so I'm now turning to
You are
you.
asking me. Oh,
I'm
sorry.
asking you, what was your first
I
impression of him?
thought your
That's right.
question was
Sorry.
addressed to
Sorry.
Garima.
Yeah.
No, my impression about him was that he was a soft individual and respected the beliefs of others, which as a fellow Christian, I felt was a very amazing quality because sometimes we followers of Christ are bent to show that we are right and everybody is wrong. But I think Dr. Stone valued our values because even according to the Bible, humans are made in the image of God. So we are free to choose what we believe. And that is one reason he did not come across as offensive, although the faith he might have held could have been different. But he was always, even when he was speaking to Christian gatherings, in the context of which I met him, you could see that spirit. Because it was an in-house meeting, he would not come down heavily on people who differed with him in any way, which I think is an exemplary quality, which I thought would be good for everyone belonging to whatever faith system, whatever culture, for us to imbibe. Yeah.
Very good. And of course, you met him in these kind of official, if I may put it that way, or private group
Correct.
settings, as you're mentioning,
Correct.
small groups around homes and things like that, which is great. Did you also get to know his family? Did you get to know him as a person?
No, not really. That is something I wish I had known. And we were living in another part of Delhi those days. And
I did meet him, of course, at college because he was a teacher at my college when I
it's in
met him
Stevens.
at St. Stephen's.
Oh.
And so when I was a student, he was a teacher. And I was amazed the first time in college at that time, I was not studying Sanskrit, but I'd studied Sanskrit in school. And when at college we had our first optional Sanskrit course, I registered for it. And I went to the first class. I was astonished to find, of course, the professor was there and all that, who was teaching us Sanskrit, Dr. Arya. I was astonished to find Dr. Stone coming and sitting alongside us students, studying Sanskrit. So I was amazed. Of course, I didn't say anything because the class was about to begin. Then at the end of the class, of course, we said hello and all that. I didn't know him well, but just said hello. Then we met somewhere and I said, oh, I was very interested to see you in the class. What were you in this class for? No, I'm studying Sanskrit, he said. So any opportunity to study Sanskrit, I come. So we were doing a very kind of intermediate course. He was, of course, far advanced. But it was very interesting. And he came religiously to every one of the classes and sat down and, refreshed his Sanskrit and built on it and all that. Fine. Then, because he was a member of the faculty, I would occasionally see him walking with his wife and his two children in the campus, in the college campus. And then I met his wife once or twice. I met his children, of course, once or twice. But it was very fascinating to see him as a family man in the college. He was not very active in any of the college societies or anything like that. We had a very active college life with many different societies. I think he may have been active in the Mathematics Society. Of course, in the Sanskrit group, he was active. But beyond that, I never saw him. He lived a very retired academic life. Then I discovered that he was interested in Sanskrit because he was interested in astrology. And that was quite fascinating for me. And then I got to know him a little bit better when I joined the faculty, because I joined the faculty of the same college. So we were colleagues. So our position then moved. As a student, I felt a little, in awe of this Oxford man who was professor of mathematics, Then we were colleagues. So I still held him in awe, but of course we were then colleagues. And then we got to know each other a little better. Then I discovered he's writing a book on astrology. So I was quite astonished, So we would have occasional talks on Sanskrit and astrology and his family and my family and all that. Then, as I said, I left Delhi in 73, lost contact. And when I arrived in England sometime in 1979, I think it was, somebody asked me if I knew Dr. Stone. I said, yes, of course, I knew her at college. But I've lost contact all these years. They said, oh, he's here on a visit. I tried to contact him, then couldn't. Then years later, when he retired from college and came to live in England, after his retirement, he spent all his working career in India. Then I reestablished contact with him, or he had reestablished contact with me. I can't remember what way around it was, through mutual friends. And then I was in touch with him. He was my guest at home. I was, of course, visiting him and so on. And one of those occasions, I asked him, "What happened to your book on astrology?" Oh, he said, "Prabhu, that's a very sad story." I said, "What is sad about it?" It was published. I have a copy. I bought a copy at that time. He said, the sad thing is it was printed in hardback. All the copies were sold out, but it was never republished. And it was never republished in paperback either. So it's out of print. So I said, "Oh, that's very sad." And that somehow stayed in my heart and mind, that it was out of print. It's so sad it was out of print. Anyway, years later, when I decided to become a publisher, one of the first thoughts that came to me was republish Dr. Stone's book. Anyway, so that's why the book got republished. Actually, after a long effort, because I had to refresh my knowledge of Sanskrit, I had to edit the whole book, check every single syllable and matra, every single mark in Sanskrit, check for the meanings and all that. And it took me 3 years of effort, of course, not full time, but it took me 3 years of effort to be able to bring the book out, because there was no electronic copy of the book. So the physical book in hardback had to be scanned page by page by me, sent to India to be retyped into an electronic document, into which I had to find a Sanskrit typist who could type it all in Sanskrit, add the English portion, the Sanskrit portions into the English portion, make sure every quote was in the right place, the whole of the quote was there, and so on. Oh my goodness, that's a lot of effort. Anyway, it got done. And now the book is here. So, LT, I just come back to you. What was your impression of the book when you first read it? I think you read it in the 80s, no, when it first came out?
Yeah, but I had read it earlier, although I don't think it was ever on Kindle, because Kindle came much later.
Yes.
And because I've been transferred left, right, and center, I do not have it now that you sent me a PDF. I am beginning to go through it and beginning to enjoy it. But what I just tell you my vague remembrance of reading the book is I was impressed with the meticulous way in which he presented the case. Of course, he brings about his own faith only towards the end. But otherwise, it was probably a scholarly, objective presentation about what Hindu astrology really was and is. Yeah. And that way, it will definitely be extremely useful as a tool for academicians and even others as well.
So, LT, you are yourself from a technical background, engineer, yes, and all that. You worked, of course, for the government for many, many years. Yes. And then you took retirement and so on, different matter. But as a technical man yourself, I'm interested to hear you say that you found the approach of the book very meticulous, thorough, scholarly, exact.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Garima, just turning to you, I don't think your background is engineering and technology. What was your impression of the book as a book?
Right. So I basically studied economics and theoretical economics. So my background is not at all technical, much more on the side of humanities. So like I said, I also found the book very, very, very technical, but then also approachable enough. So even though I had already researched a lot about astrology, so I was used to reading a lot of, like astrological principles and stuff like that. But even then, I found that I was learning a lot more from Dr. Stone's book. And at the same time, I was able to understand a lot despite coming from a non-technical background and not really knowing astrology. So I have absolutely no background in astrology at all. My book is a journalistic account of the story of astrology.
So if I may just interrupt you there, just talking about your book for a moment, right. Would you just bring us up to date on your book? When did you start research on it? And when did you finish research on it?
Right. So I started looking into the topic in the second half of 2019. So at that point, I was noticing a lot of people in US, in places like New York, Seattle, San Francisco, getting into astrology. I did my master's at Columbia University in US. And so I had a lot of people that I was connected to online on social media who were, Americans or at least non-Indians. So to me, it was very fascinating that people who are not Indians are so interested in astrology. For them, it's about memes and jokes. I mean, it's all very millennial kind of a uh, uh, entryway into astrology. Because growing up in India, I always thought of astrology as a very orthodox kind of a practice. People my age didn't want anything to do with it. So for me, this paradox was really interesting. So I started researching into it because I wanted to do a story about it. The story was published in a American magazine called The Juggernaut in January 2020. And I thought I was done with the topic. I thought, I'll just move on to different stories. But then the pandemic happened and nobody was publishing anything else. Like I could pitch the story, but nobody could publish anything other than the pandemic. So again, I think as it was kind of a fated thing, like I was meant to write this book kind of a thing. So I found a couple of books. I started reading them, just online. I started researching into it. And then when I pitched the idea to my agent, so he thought, yeah, this is something really interesting. It can work out. And, from one step to another, like things just fell into place. And I started writing the book in 2020 in July of 2020, and it took me about a year to write the book. And mostly my research ended in April 2021. So I did not research further into it. So the book, by the way, is a account of the story of astrology. So it's not just history, but it's also, why it developed, why human beings need astrology. So the simplest way to sort of express that would be that, human beings have always found this element of fate, chance, karma to their life, something they cannot explain rationally. So everyone has come up with different kinds of theories. So Indians came up with karma, Greek came up with, stoicism,
Yeah.
which, you have the adage amor fati, which is love of fate, love of one's fate. So different cultures across the world came up with different stories, different rituals, different ways of understanding it, but basically everyone was talking about this thing that we call fate, destiny, what have you. So initially it developed as a cosmology, like how does the solar system function and how are we connected to the solar system, the sun, this moon, these stars. It was a very basic kind of a way of life, very basic kind of a mythology of life, as it were. And from there, we got our gods and goddesses. Most gods and goddesses around the world are sun gods, sun goddesses, moon god, moon goddess. They are named after the planet. They're named after certain stars. They're named after, sun and moon and all that. Then the religion comes. So astrology predates religion. If we were to, really understand these things in depth.
So that's a very interesting view. It's there are two basic views of that topic. One view is that astrology and kind of nature worship predates religion, and of course, it's always a question how you define religion. And the other view is that religion or an awareness of God predates this. So there are two opposite views, and it's very interesting to have your view on it. Can I just turn your attention to, in that context of world religions and the development of world religions, one thing that Dr. Stone does, which seems to me unique about the book, is that he presents a history of the development of Indian astrology. And I'm not aware of anybody else who's done that. Maybe you, having read many books, are more aware of that. But whatever the case may be about that, what did you feel about his presentation of the history of Indian astrology and how it developed?
Right. So the only other person, by the way, to have done that, I think, is P.V. Kane, who was a very prominent
Kane,
Indologist.
of course, yes.
And for him, it was a volume of 10 books, which he called
Exactly.
History of Dharma Shastra.
Yes.
So I think I would say that his exposition on the topic is the most detailed that I've ever come across. Of course, he was writing as an Indian, and he was writing a history of Hindu texts. So he was
Yes.
not just talking
Exactly.
about astrology, he was talking about Hindu texts. So I
Yes.
think his research material was far wider, his scope of research was far wider, and even his understanding of Indian culture was, I'm sure, much deeper.
Of course, absolutely.
So,
No, that's a magisterial book. I mean, that
right,
covers everything in a sense of our history and culture.
right.
That is, of course, an amazing book. But sorry, no, carry on. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Please carry on.
So I think Dr. Stone must be the only person who is not an Indian to have researched so deeply on Indian astrology.
And I think the
So,
only person who's written a history of Indian astrology
right.
as distinct from history of Indian culture with whatever place astrology has had at times through it. But so accepting that as a non-Indian, he has, of course, a particular view of Indian astrology. What did you feel? Did you feel that the history was well done? Did you feel it was adequate? Did you feel there are gaps in it? Did you feel there are things that are overemphasized or underemphasized? What did you feel about the history of Indian astrology that he presents?
I think it could have definitely been much broader because, I mean, reading the book, I was not really expecting his study of history to be very deep, very broad. Because again, I mean, I already know that this is a British man, so I mean, I wasn't really expecting much, and I think his summary of the Indian culture or the history associated with it was a bit contained in its scope. So I think I found his dissection on the astrological principles a lot more noteworthy than the history part of it.
So, if you were writing a book on Indian astrology and the history of Indian astrology, how would you position that in terms of our culture? Because he was looking at astrology as astrology. Kane is looking at the whole of our culture.
Yeah.
And so where in the middle would you position a good history of astrology?
So I think so people tend to have very polarizing opinions on astrology. So I think Anthony Stowe's book would be a good starting point if you were trying to develop a neutral perspective on it. Neither positive nor negative, but you just want a neutral perspective on what this is, what is the context that surrounds it. Then I think Anthony Stowe's book would be the best starting point. And then maybe you move on to maybe my book and then P.V. Kane's book.
And in terms of your book, what did you find? I mean, the whole history of development of astrology around the world. What books, 2 or 3 books, did you find most helpful in that regard?
Right. So, one is obviously P.V. Kane, then is Fated Sky by Benson Bobrick.
Yes.
And then I would say Nicholas Campion's book about astrology and cosmology and world relations.
Indeed.
So these are the 3 main books that were, to me, that was the best possible resource, these 3 books.
Yes. And do you feel, you're still interested in the field, you're not researching the field like full time anymore, but you're still interested in the field. Do you feel looking at the development since Campion wrote the book, there have been any really revolutionary or significant contributions since then?
Not that I'm aware of.
So,
I mean, people research different aspects of astrology. So recently, I was attending a conference in Italy at University of Bologna, and people presented lots of different aspects, which are very narrow in scope. Not that it's not a good thing. It is obviously a great thing. But let's say someone is researching the iconography of the planets in Buddhism, just the visual iconography, or let's say someone is talking about a particular star and how it helped sailors navigate the Indian Ocean. So these are, very small in scope, but I don't think anyone has written about the history of astrology or about astrology in an academic way, very broadly since maybe Nicholas Campion.
Yeah.
especially in the Western world.
Yeah. Now, talking about that, Garima, I'd be very interested, because I think our viewers would be very interested in your summary of the difference or distinction between Jyotish, which is our approach to astrology, and the approach to astrology, let's say, in the Middle East, or certainly in the West, or in China. What would you say is distinctive about our approach to astrology as distinct from other approaches to astrology?
So I think in the Indian context, the most basic difference is the theory of karma. That we can extrapolate to the Eastern world in general, but I'm not familiar with the other schools of karma in the Eastern world. I can only talk about India. So in India, we understand life to be a series of life and death. Everything that happens to us is a result of our karma. So it's not random. Fate is not random. Fate has a logic, and that logic can come out on your birth chart. It's up to you whether to believe in it or not, whether to harmonize it or not. But that is the belief that, okay, we are living out a set of good events and bad events, and
Consequences, of
right,
our
yeah,
previous
consequences.
lives. Yeah.
And the object of life is to balance these out so that we can get moksha, which is the ultimate liberation. And so astrology is not really about, becoming more rich or becoming more powerful, becoming more attractive. It's not about those things. It's about ultimately achieving that moksha, that spiritual liberation.
And yet,
And
and yet in
right,
India, the way Jyotish is normally used
right,
is not in relation to any spiritual objective,
right,
or I should not say normally, because who knows what is normal in a country of 1.45 billion people. But let's say a lot of people
right.
don't use astrology in relation to any aid in their spiritual life. They use it to become rich, they use it to get a job, they use it to get married to the right person, they use it to escape disease or suffering. They use it for these, shall we say, material ends, rather, or psychological ends. They don't really use them for spiritual ends. So we've got a very interesting divergence between what you describe as I think rightly describe as the purpose of the whole philosophical baggage or environment or system that goes alongside it, and the actual use to which it is put by a lot of people in India. But that's a slightly different aspect from the aspect that I'm interested in pursuing at the moment with you, Garima, which is the actual system itself. If you forget the philosophical, spiritual, material, whatever baggage around it, and you said, let's look at the system as a system. Now, let's say I'm a neutral person just entering astrology for the first time, trying to understand it, and I'm confused. Oh, the Indian astrological system is different from the Chinese, is different from the Babylonian, is different from the Greek, right? Just to take three as an example. So they are similar in some ways, they're different in other ways. Once I begin to get an idea of those three, they are confusingly similar and different, right? So what would you say is the center of the difference between the Indian system of astrology and the other systems of astrology?
I think with the other system, you will be told certain things, like say, you will become a writer, or you will become, maybe after 10 years, you will lose everything, and you will lose your home, you will lose all of your money, and all of that stuff. So I think with most of the other systems, you will be given these random prescriptions, but there will be no way to understand the why and how, and like what's the point of it. Like there will be no
Well,
way to understand the meaning behind these things.
well,
And I think that, sorry.
yeah, I wonder whether that is entirely true. I don't know what you feel, LT, but I wonder if that's entirely true, because the theory behind the Western system seems to me, I'm not an expert in Western astrology or in Indian or Chinese astrology, but it seems to me that the understanding is that somehow there are some energies in the world which are represented by these planets, and these planets influence what's going on. And because we are part of the universe, we are influenced by all the energies around us. We are ourselves some kind of energy. And therefore, these energies determine by their interplay what is going on in our lives. And so, if we understand these energies are right, then, which are represented by the planets, then whoever the forecaster is, the astrologer is, can tell me, Prabhu, tomorrow such and such a thing is going to happen, or even guess, usually very rightly, what happened yesterday or 10 years ago, whatever in my life. Without knowing anything about me as a person, they can tell me, this happened 10 years ago, this is what's going to happen to you tomorrow or next year or whatever. So there is an explanation, but it's a different explanation from ours. Would you agree, or do you think that's completely off the charts? Sorry, Garima, you're frozen.
Sorry, I thought the question was for Mr. LT.
Well, both of you can answer. But let's start with you, Garima, if you like. What do you feel about what I've just said? Do you feel there's any kind of truth to that, or?
Well, I think if you were to talk to an astrologer in the West today, they might also talk about things that would seem like karma. But according to my research, that is the influence of theosophy on a lot of Western, New Age beliefs. For the astrology practice in the West today is very different than what was, happening in 16th century,
ancient,
right? So in the last century, there has been a lot of influence of theosophy, and theosophy had influences from not just Hinduism but Buddhism, and a couple of other belief systems in the world. Yes. But if we were to study their understanding of things, it coincides a lot with the Hindu theory of Advaita Vedanta, which is, we as individuals, we are part of Atman, and we have to ultimately achieve moksha, which is the liberation, and then merge into Brahman, which is the ultimate reality of it all. Yes. Yes. And so theosophy takes a very similar view about the purpose of life and the energy surrounding it, and they have a particular branch associated with it, which is which wraps this theory in the context of Christianity, that we are individuals and we have to fuse into the larger Christian consciousness. So the same kind of juxtaposition of the Atman and Brahman, just done differently, just expressed differently. So today, if we were to talk about Western astrology, if I was to get a reading from a Western astrologer, they might talk in similar terms that, okay, maybe you're getting rich because you're supposed to get rich. Maybe you have to donate. So to be able to donate a lot of money, you are getting all of this money. So that is the point of it. But I'm not sure those sort of theories or those sort of explanations would have been given to me if I was getting a reading 400 years ago. Maybe 400 years ago, they would have just told me, you will get a lot of money, and there's no other explanation for it. So, I mean, that is my perspective.
Now, sorry, LT, did you have any questions or comments or thoughts?
I wanted to ask Garima two things. One was, of course, I was impressed by your relating astrology to cosmology, which is, I think, true. It is, in a sense, quite an obvious thing, but it had never occurred to me till you mentioned it. And so, in a sense, it shows the interconnectedness of all reality, which I think, although I'm not going to attempt a definition of reality, which is a subject
huge
which has
subject,
made philosophers. Yes. So yes. I don't want to get my head into it. So that is one thing. The other thing I wanted to know whether your book, Heavens and Earth, is available on Kindle.
I believe it is.
Electronic form.
It is, yes.
It is available as an ebook.
Oh, yes. Amazing.
Yes, yes.
I'm good.
I think you'll enjoy reading it, LT.
Yeah, yes. This is really what I want to. In fact, the question I was wanting to ask is what Prabhu also asked about the link between other astrological systems and Indian astrology. And it was very pertinent that you mentioned theosophy, because theosophy, we lived in Adyar in Chennai for many years, my parents, and that's where Annie Besant, and she brought that Christian dimension to Advaita Vedanta. And so you can see that influence. I think even now the Theosophical Society of India is in that part of Chennai.
It is still in Adyar.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. But
So,
Garima, sorry, if I may, sorry, finish
yeah,
please,
go ahead,
LT.
Prabhu. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, LT's question, if I may be allowed to
Yeah,
rephrase it
yeah.
slightly to Garima. Garima, one thing that occurs to me as a result of reading your book is that if you take a long view of Indian astrology, or of West, of global astrology, but particularly in the West, you can see that astrology was popular or somehow connected with popular religion in the West up to, let's say, the 3rd, 4th century AD, when, as a result of Christian influence, astrology was basically displaced, made unfashionable, persecuted, and so on, right? And this continued right up to the 19th century. So, of course, astrology continued to be there, but was always regarded as being something for the illiterate, uneducated, marginal people somehow. So, the center of attention was not astrology. And it was really a marginal matter. For centuries, till the end of the 19th century, till the end of the 19th century, when I would say, starting with a book called Edward Arnold's book on the Buddha, on the one hand, and starting with Swami Vivekananda's speech in the World Parliament of Religions in 1895, you had two things coming together. One was the Indian kind of champion of traditional Indian beliefs, thoughts, philosophy, whatever you want to call it, and a Western champion. So two directions the promotion came from of wider Indian thought. And that wider Indian thought somehow created the atmosphere in which astrology could rise again from the 1980s onwards, even in the lives of younger people, whether in the West or in India. So that's my very amateur observation of what happened. What is your more scholarly, more thought through, more researched view of what happened? Would you agree with all of it, some of it, none of it? What is your view of what I've just said?
I think that's broadly correct. So until 17th century, I mean, it had started, the astrology's unpopularity in the West had reached its peaks by 17th century, which is when the Enlightenment happened. And I mean, astrology was not in favor for the last 200 to 300 years. And even today, when I follow conversations about astrology in the West, they tend to be very polarized. So either people are complete believers or they just completely think it is, it's garbage, shouldn't be, given any attention whatsoever. So for the crucial difference, I think, in the West and India is that in India, astrology is related to religion. So if you are a Hindu, you have some element of astrology in your life, whether you actively believe in it or not. But in the West, once we had Christianity and we had organized religion, we moved away from paganism, we moved away from nature worship. There was no point to astrology anymore. There was no deeper meaning to it. And, now it's more of a indulgence for a lot of people practicing astrology in the West. Indulgence, it is something that they get into because there's no communal space anymore, there's no religion anymore. They need to make sense of their life, they need to make sense of their surroundings. And so astrology just happens to be one of the tools that they use. So one tool could be astrology, another tool could be therapy, another tool could be traveling, another tool could be just focusing on your career, or or another tool could be complete consumerism. So astrology is just one of those tools. It is completely decentered from religion, from a deeper meaning of life, from a collective way of existence. So I think that is the case with how astrology was decentered and in what context it has been practiced in the West. In India, however, it was always related to religion, even at the very start. I mean, the basic practice of Hinduism, which is, having a sacred sacrifice, ritual sacrifice, which we in Hindi call Havan. So, which is done by a priest. It is done at a particular time and day, which is Muhurat. Right?
Yes.
And Muhurat is calculated
Of course.
by the,
conjunction of the stars and
right,
so on.
right.
Yes.
So, a ritual sacrifice could be done for any reason. It could be to start a business, to get married, maybe a baby's born. So anything that we do as Hindus is chipped into that astrological instinct of, how can we make it auspicious? I'm starting a new activity. How can I make it auspicious? Or how can I avoid inauspiciousness? Like people will not do anything major on a solar eclipse, on a lunar eclipse, or during the days of Shraddh, which
Yes.
is when we remember the departed
Yes.
family members.
Yes.
So for us, it has that kind of meaning. Even if I'm not aware of it, even if I don't know anything about Muhurat or astrology or whatever, if I'm taking part in a ritual sacrifice, in a puja, in a havan, I am participating in it. That thought, that primordial thought of aligning with the energies of the universe, of aligning the microcosm with the macrocosm. So I think that is the major difference.
That is very interesting. LT, did you have any observations on that or any questions in relation to that? I was very struck by what
Yes,
Garima
in
said.
fact,
Maybe you
I
were as
am
well.
quite fascinated by it because I've been reflecting on astrology from in a position as a Christian. Now, whether astrology is true or not is really not the issue. Why it became unpopular, probably in those till the 17th century or so, as you both mentioned. I would think it is because, in one sense, in a theological sense, Christian theological sense, God wanted us to decide freely about what we would do. Because I've often discussed this with my Hindu colleagues during my days in the government. When will you be truly free to decide if you knew the future or if you did not know the future?
That's very
And that
fascinating.
is an
Yes.
interesting question because only if you did not know the future, you'll be free to choose. Otherwise, the knowledge that this is what is going to happen is going to kind of paralyze you and not enable you to take a decision. I would like to ask Garima whether she has thought on these lines ever.
So that's a very interesting question. Are you more free? Would you be more free if you knew what's going to happen? Or would you be more free if you did not know what's going to happen? Very interesting question. Garima, please.
Yeah.
Right. So I think if I knew my future, right, and someone said something bad was going to happen, or I was going to do something wrong, so I might try not to do it. But then if I were to take the perspective of karma, I would still end up doing it. Despite knowing that I should not do it, this is wrong, I would still somehow end up doing it. So, or conversely, if I did not know my future, I did not know what I was supposed to do, and I would think, oh, I'm doing this out of my free will. I'm doing this because I chose to do it. But then something still doesn't work out, right? Because it was just not meant to happen. So again, I think the question here is not necessarily about what I know or what I do not know. It's a question of what I believe. Do I believe that I'm free, or do I believe I'm not free? And
That's
I
very
think
interesting.
in
Yeah.
that case, it doesn't matter whether you know about astrology or not, whether you believe in it or not. The most crucial point is what you believe. If you believe yourself to be free, you still go through life believing that you're free. And again, you can rationalize in your brain that, okay, maybe I did not work hard enough, maybe the person was not fair to me, or whatever. You can rationalize things either way, whether you believe in something or not, believe in something or do not believe in something. So I
But
think
don't you think the very fact that somebody tells you you are going to have an accident, let's say tomorrow, right? Or you're going to die day after tomorrow, or you're going to come into a fortune 2 days
right,
later, right?
right.
Just the fact that somebody has said something like that, even if I do not believe in it, right, is going to influence my thinking. It is therefore going to shape the choices I make, just my reaction to that information. But if I believe in the person who's telling me you're going to have an accident, you're going to die, you're going to come into this fortune, then my reaction is certainly going to be influenced by that knowledge. So whether I believe in astrology or not, whether I believe I'm a free agent or not, just the fact of having the information is going to influence my actions one way or the other. So in that sense, I'm being influenced in my actions, whatever I believe. Isn't that the case?
I think again it can go either way.
Uh-huh.
I think a lot depends on your personal experiences in your life.
That is
So
true.
for
Yes.
for instance, I never thought I was going to be a writer. I had absolutely no interest in writing. But somehow life led me down this path. I became a journalist, and then I ended up writing a book. And I had no interest in astrology. I There is no one in my family who is an astrologer. My parents don't consult astrologers that much. So I was interested in the idea of fate
Yes.
because of my own personal experiences in life. And somehow this book ended up happening. So for me, my own personal experiences tell me that it doesn't matter what anyone tells me or not. It doesn't matter what I want or not. If something is meant to happen, it will still happen, whether I'm influenced or not. If I'm influenced, then I was meant to be influenced. If I do not get influenced, then I was not meant to be influenced. So yeah.
From an Indian point of view, it could be said that you are a bit of a fatalist, and from a Western point of view, it could be said that you believe in sort of a modern scientific idea which is equivalent to fate, or which is chemical determination or DNA determination or whatever. So you're a determinist. But I'm very interested to have had your answer. LT, any responses to that from your point of view?
You know, I have struggled with this whole idea. I'm even from a Western scientific point of view. See, if there is determinism, which is determining what I'm going to do, is there a way of, is it possible to be held responsible for anything if
Ah,
determinism is ruling the roost?
that's a
That
very interesting
that
point.
yeah,
Yeah.
that is linked with the earlier point I made. When are you free to take a decision, which means you're going to accept responsibility for whatever decision you take. Whereas when everything is fixed and determined, is there any place for responsibility?
That's very interesting.
Yeah,
That's very interesting.
worth thinking about. I mean, I'm just
Yeah.
throwing this thought for, I mean, a researcher like Garima. I think she can probably write another book on this subject,
There you
which
are,
I would
Garima. You're
like
a
to.
writer. Here's an idea for a new
Yeah,
book.
go ahead, go for it.
So I think even if someone commits a crime that they tried their best not to commit, they would still be held responsible because again that is their karma. So the theory of free will or the theory of determinism cannot just be used to our convenience. It also works against us. So I think whatever one believes in, whether it's free will or determinism, we have to accept it for better and for worse. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, but the point is, suppose the better or worse factor does not come into the picture, then what do you say? I mean, that is the point. If everything is going to be determined by whether it's going to be good for me or bad for me, again, I am circumscribed by certain conditions. That's the question I'm just throwing it
Yeah.
for you to think about. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So our time is nearly up. Not quite, but we've got a few minutes.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts from you, LT, first, and then from Garima?
Yeah.
Any other top thoughts on the topic of Hindu astrology or astrology in general, or on Dr. Stone would be very welcome.
No, I realized that Garima is very well read. So I was just wondering whether she's thinking of another book on another topic. Because
Ah,
I'm definitely going to get the Kindle version of your Heavens and Earth. But do you have something which is nagging you? I must do something right. That's how writers get started.
yeah. What is your next
Uh,
book project, huh?
yeah.
Right. So the next book project is about the cult of instant gratification. So I'm not writing about astrology anymore. So the next book is about basically the modern culture and what the modern culture misses out by being overly focused on the material aspect of life, which in our generation is mostly about instant gratification. We not just want everything material, we want it right away. And I think this follows directly from my book about astrology because now I understand that, okay, everyone has a certain life path, everyone will have certain hits and certain misses. And this is something that the modern world does not understand anymore, that you cannot have everything, and you cannot have everything right away, at least. So the book is going to be about the cult of instant
Instant
gratification.
gratification. Yes, you
Excellent.
announced that book earlier in your public statements, Garima. I was very interested in that, and I'm sure LT will be very interested in it as well.
Yeah,
But since it was LT's question, what is LT's response to your question?
I agree with that. See, many years ago, Neil Postman made that point, no? Amusing oneself to
Ourselves
death,
to death.
which is really what is happening now. And probably in your book, you will include addiction to gadgets as well, because they
I'm sorry,
seem to
we'll introduce what?
present
I'm sorry,
gadgets, the
gadgets.
instant
Gadgets.
video
Yeah,
games and things
yeah,
like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That would
So,
be an interesting analysis, because I
yeah.
think from a non-religious, non-theological perspective, a book like that would be very helpful for us to be able to see the pros and cons of various things like artificial intelligence. Now, I happen to be the part of the first batch of MTech students from IIT Madras, and our convocation speaker was Sir C.V. Raman. And he made a statement. He was speaking without notes, although you can access his lecture on our website. He said, when you engineers and technologists leave this institute, you will be tempted to prostitute your knowledge for the service of human greed. Now, I have been thinking about it, and it suddenly occurred to me more recently that when we were in school, our only source of news was newspaper and radio. And now that we have AI, we have 5G, we have Chat GPT, we have news and fake news, and we have to have fact check, which interestingly says it's not against knowledge, but how knowledge has to be circumscribed in some way by certain moral values, which we possess or not, is really what I would expect your book to bring out. Because I think that is going to be a very important factor. See, gadgets which are very useful, for example, when husband and wife are both working, they give the child a phone, an iPhone or something, to play with videos. Now that becomes part of that child's personality when he or she grows up, and how that is going to affect. I mean, that brings a whole lot of social dimensions as well as ethical dimensions. So I will never forget. This was 31st July 1966 when I heard Sir C.V. Raman. And it has just stayed in my mind, because that
Could you
was
just
such a...
could you just repeat that statement so we don't miss it or forget it?
Yeah. He said, basically, he was part of Einstein's anti-nuclear weapons program. So he said, when you engineers and technologists leave this institute, you will be tempted to prostitute your knowledge for serving human greed, particularly in the manufacture of nuclear weapons. If I remember correctly, that was his sum and substance.
Yeah.
That means don't simply be happy about possessing this knowledge. You will have to take certain ethical decisions with this knowledge. That's what he was putting to us young people.
And you have chosen well, LT, if I may say so, in your life. You have devoted your life to the service of humanity, whether as a technologist, as an engineer, or later in life, which is great to see. And Garima, in your own way, you may not recognize it, or you may recognize it, I don't know. You are also serving humanity by writing these books and by your journalism. And may I draw this discussion to a close just by drawing everybody's attention again to this book, Hindu Astrology. And Garima, you don't have your book there, do you?
I do. I just
Would you please
Yeah,
pick it
why
up
don't
and
right.
show it to
you
everybody?
take it? Yeah.
Bring it right up to the screen.
Can you bring it to the
That's right.
camera?
There we are.
Okay.
That is Garima's book. If you viewers have not yet got hold of Garima's book, please do get hold of it. It's a fascinating book, very well written book, and thoroughly recommended for reading, as is, of course, Hindu Astrology by Dr. A.P. Stone, Anthony P. Stone. May I thank both Garima and ULT for your contributions and your time and your very fascinating remarks, which have actually been very educational for me as well. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you, Prabhu,
Thank you
for
so much
having
for
me
having
over.
us.
Yeah.